Welcome into Daily Faceoff Live, your go-to source for everything hockey. Live every weekday at noon Eastern.
Welcome into a May 23rd edition of Daily Faceoff Live, brought to you by Betano. The game starts now at betano.ca. We are streaming live on the Daily Faceoff YouTube, as well as our Twitter and Facebook accounts. I'm Tyler Yaremchuk, and he is our NHL insider, Frank Saravalli. How's it going, Frank?
Pretty good, Tyler. How are you?
I'm living. I am living. Before we dig into our four topics today, just a little bit of housekeeping notes. I suppose yesterday we talked about Craig Conroy being the new GM in Calgary. That is going to be made official today, correct, Frank?
Correct. 12 noon Mountain Time, 2 p.m. Eastern is when the Flames are holding their press conference to introduce not just Craig Conroy as their next general manager, but also Dave Nonis, who I believe is joining the team in a senior vice president role, which also has, I think, an assistant general manager title attached to it. Either way, going to have a seat at the table, and I'll be curious to see if they mention Jarome Iginla at all in an advisory or consultant role.
I'm coming to you from the city where Jarome Iginla has a rink named after him. So there's a random little tie-in right there, Frank. Let's talk about some playoff hockey, though. Throwing 2 minutes and 30 seconds up on the clock to start with Sergei Bobrovsky, Frank, a guy who a couple of months ago was the $10 million zero. Well, now he's the $10 million hero. 32 stops in Game 3, a shutout victory for the Florida Panthers as they take a 3-0 stranglehold on the Carolina Hurricanes. And Frank, I'll get your thoughts on this in just a second, but let's take a look at just how remarkable this run from Bobrovsky is. When you look at the first 3 games of a conference final, he ranks ahead of some pretty impressive names when you look at total saves made in the first 3 games of a conference final. And this is a guy whose game has been trending in a good direction for a while, and he seems to be peaking right now. A .978 save percentage this round after a .943 against Toronto. And it comes after, again, Frank, a roller coaster of a regular season for Bob. You look at his save percentages month by month through the year for the Florida Panthers. Up, down, up, down. That thing was peaking and falling like the Rocky Mountains. Quite remarkable to see the way Sergei Bobrovsky has gone on this run, Frank, and in a way carried the Panthers to where they are now in the playoffs.
Yeah, there's no question. He's absolutely locked in. And by the way, I can't wait for someone to write the story at some point that, oh man, is this contract, will it have been worth it if the Florida Panthers can win the Stanley Cup? And I'm going to say the answer on that is still a hard no. It's still one of the worst contracts that's ever been signed in NHL history. However, it speaks to, first off, the variability and fickleness of the position. I think it's the most fickle position in pro sports. You don't know what you're getting week to week, let alone year to year in a multi-year contract for goaltenders. And he's just playing at his absolute peak. I don't think even when Sergei Bobrovsky won 2 Vezina trophies, did he play as well as he's played right now. So certainly not taking anything away from Sergei Bobrovsky when I say this next part, which is, we've reached the Carolina Hurricanes are like watching paint dry stage of the Eastern Conference Final, because I don't know who transported us back to 2001, but this has been a really tough series to watch. And, you know, all credit to Sergei Bobrovsky, 132 saves on 135 shots in the series. I feel like I can count on 3 fingers or 5 fingers how many scoring chances or really quality grade A chances the Canes have had. I think their style of play, in addition to missing some of their top scorers, has been their biggest enemy. You know, it's like dump and chase, repeat, wash, repeat. It's like over and over and over again, like enough. Please, someone carry the puck into the zone. Please, someone get to within the dots. Make something happen inside of home plate. That's what the Hurricanes have been missing, and now they're down to their last gasp.
Yeah, and it really doesn't look like they're going to be able to solve Bobrovsky enough to get 1 win, never mind the 4 consecutive they need to save their season. Alexander Barkov left the game, did not return. Paul Maurice, speaking today, doing his radio hit in Florida, said, quote, "We don't think it's anything too sinister in regards to in regards to Alexander Barkov's injury." So potentially good news there, Frank. But isn't there a part of you when you look at the series up 3-0? They should probably just play it safe, right?
Oh, 100%. They now have the luxury of time. I think that's why, as Paul Maurice said, they were hopeful that he could have came back for game 3. And in that case, sit him out. You're leading in game 3. You have a chance to go up 3-0 in the series. As you mentioned, a stranglehold. I don't see any lifeline for the Carolina Hurricanes to get back in the series, which sounds kind of odd when you actually think about the way these games have played out. You could make the argument that in the 3 games, in the totality of the 3 games, regardless of what the series scoreboard says, they might have actually been the better team. Like it sounds funny to say that, but in this case, the Panthers, they don't ask you how, just like Sergei Bobrovsky's regular season. They just ask you at the end how many wins, and that's all that matters. Is they continue to fill up that puck tree in their locker room on their way to the Stanley Cup final.
Double OT of game 1. They hit a crossbar with almost a wide open net on a power play. The Canes did, that is. And you think about how different this series is if that puck finds a way to go in. Let's shift gears and head out west, where the Dallas Stars are looking to avoid a similar fate to the Carolina Hurricanes. The difference being, I guess, that Dallas hasn't lost on home ice yet, which makes tonight's game 3 between them and the Golden Knights that much more pivotal. For me, what Dallas needs to do, Frank, to get themselves back in this series is eliminate one mistake per game. You look back in games 1 and 2, obviously both overtime losses with Stevenson and Howden being the heroes there. But I mean, at the end of game 2, they had that thing, and it was Ryan Suter making some gaffes, and the Stars just seemed to, for lack of a better phrase, fumble the bag late in that hockey game. Frank, when you look at this series so far, what does Dallas need to do to get back into it?
Yeah, that was a heck of a senior moment for one of the NHL's senior citizens there in Ryan Suter. Unforgivable, really, especially given his experience. And when I look at this series and how razor thin the margin is, this is going to sound more critical than it's meant to be, but they need a stop from Jake Ottinger. You see the series save percentage, you look at the save percentage for the playoffs as a whole, 901 isn't going to get it done. And when you get to OT and you get late in games, trying to hang on to a lead, you need your goalie to bail you out every once in a while when you make a mistake like that. And I feel like that's been one of the true difference makers in this series has been they haven't gotten that. Because think about what the conversation was like heading into this round. Need more from Jason Robertson. Okay, well, he scored in each of the first 2 games of this series. You need pick a player. For the most part, they've gotten it. And, while this hasn't been high scoring by any stretch of the imagination, it's not like I'm sitting here saying, oh, that's what they're left needing is more offense. I think you framed it perfectly by saying they need to cut down on the mistakes that they're making because that's what's biting them in the ass.
Yeah, and I like that you brought up Jason Robertson. He appears to be finding his stride a little bit in this series after a couple of slow series to start this playoff run here. They need more from him. I mean, the Benassance
Where you at, Tyler Seguin?
Yeah, I mean, there are still a lot of passengers with this hockey club right now. And I mean, coming back on home ice should give them a boost. I always say, and the feeling, I guess, around the Stanley Cup playoffs is you're never really in trouble till you lose at home. But the problem when you don't have home ice advantage is, Frank, if you lose this first one at home, like it could be over before it's even really gotten going, it feels like. In both of these conference finals, it's wild.
I was projecting heading into this series, this round, both series, 6 or 7 games. Like I didn't envision a short series at all for either one of them. And now you're looking at the Florida Panthers being able to sweep on Wednesday night. And if the Golden Knights are able to win on Tuesday night, another 3-0 series stranglehold. And guess what? All of a sudden, Tyler, the people in the NHL head office there that run the events, they're all of a sudden scrambling saying, oh no, we might have to move up the Stanley Cup final, which was scheduled to start not until June 3rd. Contingency plans are being put in place. I can tell you that.
Yeah. Let's shift to off-season mode here and start with Kyle Dubas releasing a statement, the former Leafs GM. And Frank, a lot of it was, the usual, thanking the staff and everyone around MLSE for everything they've done for him over the past few years. But for me, the interesting part is in the first 3 lines where he says, while I understand there is interest surrounding the circumstances of my departure, I will not get into the specifics of what I consider to be reasonable and consistent, but private discussions. That there felt like a little bit of a, I didn't like the way that press conference was handled by Brendan Shanahan kind of jab. Sorry, go ahead. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I said a little bit. Like it's quite obvious that Kyle Dubas was hurt by the specificity and detail that Brendan Shanahan went into his press conference with. And frankly, when making a decision like that, he had no choice given the sort of popularity and thought of Kyle Dubas around the league to do nothing else other than to provide that detail, lest he get way more questions than what he ended up getting on Friday. But I could understand it from Kyle Dubas's perspective. I guess what sort of shocks me with his statement is that he kind of seemed to double down on this idea of ensuring that I had the full support of my family for what I knew would be required in the offseason and years to follow. Like, I have full respect for anyone that is family first in their focus when it comes to their employment and their job. However, I think he made a grave tactical error last Monday when he brought up the idea that he wasn't sure and needed to discuss with his family. First off, no one's buying that because you were in the final year of your deal. And if you think that that wasn't a sort of weekly conversation or topic of conversation between Kyle Dubas and his wife, like, I mean, come on. Everyone knew where this was heading, whether they lost in round 2 or round 4 or whatever it was. This was a conversation that ultimately needed to be had. So to think that it was just parked for the meantime of the season, I think is irrational to begin with. And then second, people are playing the world's tiniest violin for you when you talk about that. Like, if you want to talk about the stress of a job, let's talk about the real stresses of a job. For a police officer or a firefighter or someone that's a first responder who is like quite literally putting their life on the line every day when they go to work. That is real stress of a job. Not someone making $2.5 million running one of the premier franchises in the NHL. No one's shedding a tear for you. So to kind of go back to that well again, I was a little bit surprised. Like, that's like, you probably should have left that part out of the statement because no one feels bad for you, especially now that you're in this spot that you can go and pick the next destination, probably where you work and when you decide to get back in again. Most people in life don't have that luxury. So I think perspective is important here.
Just quickly before we wrap this up, some reports that the Penguins could have permission to speak with him. What's the latest on anything surrounding that?
Yeah, so I would say I do believe Kyle Dubas is scheduled to engage with the Pittsburgh Penguins about their open GM/president of hockey ops position. I think the Penguins ownership group has been traveling the Grand Prix in Monaco. I believe they were there. I do think they put their search on hold until they could get a definitive answer with some of the other candidates that they've spoken to and gone pretty far in the process until they get an answer from Kyle Dubas. But at the same time, my sense the whole time has been his interest level in this position isn't all that high, given that Pittsburgh's competitive window, their best days are behind us to win, and an arduous rebuild is then in store. My eye, and in terms of where Kyle Dubas may head next, is kind of hinges on the sale of the Ottawa Senators. Who is the winning bid? What are their plans for their front office? And does Kyle Dubas factor into that? Because it's just a way better situation, I think, for him. A way more competitive team on the upswing that he also, by the way, grew up rooting for. And just seems to fit. And can you imagine the narrative that would come from that? Leafs, Sens, the legitimate Battle of Ontario that people have been cheering for a while, to finally get that and have Kyle Dubas running the Sens. That would be quite something. But again, he's going to work when he decides he wants to work.
We're running a little behind here. We're going to get to our pal Corey Masisak in 2 minutes here for part 2 of our offseason previews for the day. Going to zero in on the Sharks with him. But first, let's talk about another Western Conference team here, Frank. The Arizona Coyotes are up next in our offseason previews. And, I mean, you think back to last week, Logan Cooley, the top 3 pick from last year, saying he's going back to school. And the word was, hey, there's some definitely some uncertainty about what's going on with the future of this Coyotes franchise. And that led to him going back to school for another year. Is it fair to say they might have trouble getting players, recruiting free agents, things like that this offseason, Frank, with all the drama surrounding their arena deal?
Yeah, and I don't expect them to be super active in the free agent market anyway, but
Yeah.
How do you think the number 6 and 12 overall picks are going to feel when they're selected by the Arizona Coyotes in a few weeks? Probably not that great. If you could pick any team to not be selected by, they would kind of be toward the top of the list, given this circus that's embroiled this franchise for, I don't know, the last 15 years that has now finally come to a head. I think everyone would like to see some kind of clarity now as to what is next for the Arizona Coyotes, but they're out of answers. They're scrambling. They're like a duck underwater right now, trying to paddle to shore to save themselves, because really their entire franchise future is at stake based on where they're heading next. This, first off, you have to get someone to want you, some municipality, someone to buck up and to build your arena. And two, you can't go wrong. You can't get it wrong. And then time is of the essence related to all of that. So when I think of the Coyotes, I think number one priority is actually like having a franchise in Arizona, vis-a-vis the next arena for the Coyotes. And then two, what about the rest of it? What about building this team out? What about checking a lot of the positional boxes that exist for this team moving forward? They've got a lot of really nice pieces. They've got a bevy of draft picks. And I kind of wonder about sort of the future of everything now that, Bill Armstrong has kind of timed this perfectly in the sense of, hey, we're going to be really good when we hit the ice in 3 years in our new home in Tempe. Well, that's out the window now. And now I think you also have to put a little bit more of an onus on having a bit of a more competitive team that you could draw interest into to maybe solve some of the first part of your problem. So where are the Coyotes going? The answer, unfortunately, is nowhere fast enough.
Yeah, it's going to be something, man. In the next 3 years, in the first 3 rounds of the draft, they have 22 picks. That is
Can't even sign them all.
Yeah, like I don't know. That's why I'm like, man, are they going to look to move some of these and get some players on their roster? Their highest paid defenseman under contract for next year is Patrick Nemeth at $2.5 million. Like, it's just go look at their cap friendly page. It's absolutely
probably
hilarious.
Overpaid at that too.
Yeah. Let's keep going along and get into today's edition of the All 32 with our pal Corey Masisak. Corey Masisak covers the San Jose Sharks over at The Athletic. Appreciate you giving us some time here today, Corey. Let's dig into this San Jose Sharks offseason that's coming up here. And I guess the obvious one to start with is Erik Karlsson. What's your read on the situation surrounding the 100-point defenseman? Is it more likely than not that the Sharks are going to move this guy?
I think it's more like, well, it's in Erik's hands at this point, I think. I mean, whenever everybody broke at the end of the season, Mike Grier said, we're going to give Erik time. We're going to let him figure out what he needs to figure out. Look, he's got 4 more years on his contract. This year was, otherworldly. How much that has helped his trade value, because there's still the length on the contract. There's still the injury history is sort of to be determined. But I mean, I think the reality of it is it basically comes down to if Erik Karlsson, is watching what Brent Burns is doing, is watching what Joe Pavelski is doing and saying, hey, I want to do that before the end of my career, or let's say over the next couple of seasons, he's going to have a talk with Mike Grier, and he's going to say, hey, if you can find a place for me, and then they're going to try to figure something out. But I mean, Grier has said repeatedly that they'd be fine with keeping him. As kind of the entire roster showed this season, having, this 100-point defenseman on the roster didn't necessarily hinder their ability to get a high pick in the draft. So, I think, look, he's been the number one story here, even when Timo Meier was sort of being, bandied about as a trade possibility. The specter of being able to trade Karlsson, given the financial implications, was kind of still story number one.
So just for clarity, Corey, I'm kind of intrigued by what you're saying, in that I guess from way out here on the East Coast, I was under the assumption that, and reading and watching the interviews from Erik Karlsson, that he's like more than ready to go. Is that not the case?
Well, yeah. I mean, he every time he talks about it, he says, I want to win, but I also love living in San Jose and I love playing for this team. And there's a lot of like his family, he has built a family in San Jose, and his wife and his small children, like, they love it here. And so I think he's a little bit conflicted by that. I think if he could have in a kind of a perfect world situation, Greer would say, hey, here's our timeline. We're going to be good again before your contract is up. And he would say, okay, but are they actually going to be able to pull that off? It's a whole nother story. So, I mean, look, I would say, I thought that before the trade deadline, it was going to be really hard for them to get something done, but both sides were kind of motivated to do it. And now we'll see, now that they've had kind of some time away from each other. But I think if Eric does want to go, I mean, if he continues to just say like, look, I want to win, that, that I think that's, they're at least going to try to make that happen. There's also this thing that like, he could want to leave and they could want to trade him and it still might not work out. Like, I mean, there has been interest from other teams, but it's still like huge hurdles. How much money are the Sharks going to retain to make it work? What is another team going to be willing to give up given the uncertainty of how healthy he can stay moving forward? All those things kind of play into this.
Yeah, no doubt. I think it's incredibly difficult contract to move, even with a 100-point season, given the injury history, given the sheer cap consequences for someone to bring a contract like that in. You're likely looking at moving out $7, $8, $10 million just to be able to fit Karlsson in. So it is going to be difficult. My real intrigue with the Sharks in their summer is outside of Karlsson, what's the clear number 2 priority for the Sharks to figure out? Like, I look at this team and I say, it's an absolute mess. They're kind of in no man's land, a 4th straight year at the bottom of the standings. They're not getting any better. They don't have, this great sort of cap space scenario where they can begin to get creative and start to stockpile picks. Like, what do you view as the next biggest thing for Mike Grier to tackle this summer?
Yeah, that to me, that beyond Karlsson, that's like the most interesting thing about this offseason for them is who are they going to take with the number 4 pick? That guy immediately becomes kind of the future face of the franchise almost. And then number 2, are they like, they could just sit here and do basically nothing, like just very, very minimal around the edges and basically run it back and take another run at the number 1 pick. Like they kind of did. They weren't outright tanking like Chicago and Arizona were, but they ended up there, within a couple of points of getting the number 1 pick. So they could just do that and just, pair the number 4 pick and whoever it is they get at the start of the 2024 draft. And then that's like kind of your future, your Kane, Taves, Malkin, Crosby foundation. But they're not as hardline about this we're never rebuilding thing. They're sort of like walking that back a little bit. And so like, but they do continue to say they want to win as soon as they can. So like, I think basically the way to put it is I think they're going to be like patient. And if someone comes if the Rangers couldn't sign Keandre Miller and they just put him up for bid, basically, I think the Sharks would get in on that. However, I think that if there are like young controllable players out there that they could add to like kind of take a step forward next season, they would like to do that. Now, again, the salary cap situation is weird because they have like 4. They're basically down to 4 huge contracts, but they're all very long. And there's not a lot of they have like Kevin LeBanc and Radim Shimmick who are on the last year of their deal. And so like if they basically just wait those out instead of giving up like a 3rd round pick to move one of them, then they do have cap flexibility next summer. But then they still have those 4 guys that are on the long contracts that are, some measure of immovable.
Just quickly in 30 seconds before we let you go, any shot they buy out a guy like Marc-Edouard Vlasic?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think Greer was pretty adamant that the buyouts are not. I mean, they're just where they're at. Like if they were 8 points away from the playoffs last year and they needed that extra $3 or $4 million to add one more player to make a run, I think they would be willing to do it. But I think they're just waiting, I think maybe another year or 2 before that even really comes into the conversation.
Perfect. Appreciate the insight, Corey. Thanks for hopping on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Mm. moving along on the show to our daily face-off inbox question, hashtag AskDFO. I asked Corey at the end there about Vlasic, Frank, because it ties into our inbox question today, which is centered around high-priced buyouts this summer. And I want to flash this up. Our friends at Cap Friendly, one of the things in the corner of their site is the popular buyouts that fans are doing. And I always get a kick out of seeing what fans are clicking on the most to see where their teams can get some cap relief. Do you think we'll see any high-priced buyouts around the NHL this summer?
I don't. I'd be very surprised. I think the best case, the best option on this list, or most likely, if any of them, would be Oliver Ekman-Larsson. I project Matt Murray's going to LTIR. John Tavares is going nowhere. Mikael Granlund doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I think they're better off trying to trade him, even if they have to give up something, rather than buying him out. Jack Campbell's not going anywhere. If the Oilers are smart, they'd rehab him. Barclay Goodrow, the juice isn't really worth the squeeze. Mike Riley, don't think so. They'll just stash him if they need to. And Mike Hoffman, I'm told the Canadians are trying to move, but aren't going to be paying a huge price in order to do it.
An Oliver Ekman-Larsson buyout would also be a split cost as well, with around $500,000, $300K to $600K per year going to the Arizona Coyotes, and the Canucks obviously eating the bulk of that. Let's move along to our Betano Daily Bets. Game 3 of the Western Conference Final goes tonight, and our friends at Betano have the odds up, and they got a lot of them, so let's dig into it. The game starts now at betano.ca. Frank, I like the Stars to win tonight. This series has been tight. I really don't think we're going to have both series end at 3-0 through 3 games, so I am riding with the home side. The Dallas Stars not getting a great payout. The home ice advantage tilts the line a little bit to -133, but I like the Stars in this spot. And for my player prop, the Benessons. Jamie Benn has still been on a tear, and he is actually one of the better payouts on this Stars team to just get a point tonight, coming in at right around -130, -140. So Jamie Benn to pick up a point feels like a great spot, again, considering how many names are above him on the list and how well he's been playing. Taking Benn and the Stars to win tonight in Game 3 between the Stars and Golden Knights, and that will bring us to wrap up the show with a little garbage time. What do you got, Frank?
Well, it seemed like after Game 3, everyone was in good spirits in Florida, because even though they spent the last half of the game at least without their captain and Alexander Barkov, you see this reaction from Paul Maurice.
Paul, first, any updates on Sasha?
Nope.
Talking to the guys, they talked about
a bar mitzvah. His neighbor had that's what we'll go with. Bar mitzvah. And he didn't want to disappoint the kids.
Is that upper or lower?
The bar mitzvah?
Yeah.
It's on 2 floors. It's on both floors. It's a big one.
First off, full marks. I don't know who was actually asking the question, but to ask, is that upper or lower? Well done there. On one hand, Tyler, I absolutely hate this, the reporter in me, because I think it just speaks to how much of an absolute joke the NHL's injury policy is when it comes to not even being able to tell us whether it was an upper or lower body injury, even though it clearly seemed to be an upper. In this case, though, and that goes back to a larger conversation about gambling and all sorts of clarity that I think the public should know if they're putting their hard-earned money on a series. But the NHL clearly doesn't have any interest in that. On the other hand, I really enjoyed the comedy hour from Paul Maurice, who is a funny bastard in his own right. And certainly to come up with that on the fly, he didn't want to disappoint the kids. I mean, come on, that's about as good as it gets. And you can certainly see a coach that is relaxed and enjoying his lot in life, one win away from the Florida Panthers' first trip to the Stanley Cup Final since before Tyler was born.
2 floors. I love that little part. Also, Frank, I want to give a shout out to Brooks Koepka, winner of the PGA Championship, who shows up at the game. Obviously a diehard Panthers fan. And how about, as Pete Blackburn pointed out, this insane clap to blink ratio that Brooksy had going on as well. Quite the weekend for him. He won a ton of money by winning the PGA Championship. And knowing what I do about Brooks and listening to different interviews he's done, probably won a little bit of money off his Florida Panthers winning Game 3 as well.
Yeah, seemed like that was a chemically induced clap there.
Let's wrap up the show there. Thanks to everyone who tuned in on the Daily Faceoff YouTube. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button before you go. Stephen Ellis and more coming up tomorrow on the show. So we hope to see you then at noon Eastern.
Thanks for tuning in to Daily Faceoff Live. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to never miss an episode.